Why, after all, do women desire the man who doesn't care? This question is disturbing, challenging, and even revolting, but to ignore it is to be blind to one of the most brutal truths of human psychology. Carl Jung said that the unconscious desires not the obvious, but what remains veiled. And that's why detachment is seen as strength, while need is seen as weakness. It's not a game, nor manipulation. It's pure psychic dynamics. The more you chase, the further the other runs away. The more you demonstrate that you can't survive without her, the more she feels you're no longer valuable. And here's the provocation. The man who offers himself completely before the time is seen as disposable. The man who doesn't care is seen as rare. It seems unfair, doesn't it? But look around. The colleague who doesn't beg for attention is exactly the one everyone wants by their side. The friend who doesn't need to be everywhere is the one most remembered when he's absent. The man who doesn't kneel for approval is the same one who arouses fascination without saying a word. And here's the point few dare admit. It's not kindness that attracts. It's the absence of need. It's not the promise that generates desire, but the silent presence. Because in the end, it's not about being perfect, but about not needing applause to exist. If that sounds harsh, wait until you hear what comes next. Because in the next few minutes, you'll understand why indifference activates the shadow of desire, how absence can be more powerful than 1,000 words, and what really happens when the good persona dies and the self awakens to speak in its own voice. The feminine instinct that confuses coldness with power. It's curious how the feminine instinct, often unconscious, tends to associate masculine coldness with a kind of hidden power. Carl Jung already explained that the unconscious operates through symbols, and when a woman encounters a seemingly distant man, her imagination connects this emotional absence to an archetype of strength. She doesn't realize that what lies before her isn't necessarily power, but the projection of her own desire for that which seems inaccessible. Spirituality teaches that the ego loves to transform mystery into fascination. And in this game, the masculine persona, even unintentionally, gains a magnetic aura. It's not coldness that attracts, but the symbolic reflection it awakens within. This confusion is as old as the stories of silent kings who, with just a look, commanded respect without needing to raise their voices. If you pay attention, you'll notice that society reinforces this myth in soap operas, films, and even songs. The cold man who speaks little but seems sure of himself receives more attention than the man who strives to please. It's as if coldness becomes a mask of virtue, a persona that hides common human weaknesses. Shadow work helps us understand that behind this confusion lies the projection of the female shadow itself, the desire for what cannot be easily possessed. This is where Jungian psychology and spirituality meet. It's not about the man, it's about what he represents in her psyche. And this doesn't mean the man needs to become cold or distant. It just means that emotional absence, paradoxically, carries more symbolic weight than excessive availability. In practice, this feminine instinct can be seen in simple situations. A man responds to messages sparingly, and this creates more expectation than one who responds immediately with hearts and compliments. This doesn't mean that the ideal is to manipulate or become inaccessible, but rather to understand that silence, in many contexts, can speak louder than words. The male ego, when constantly seeking approval, loses magnetism because it reveals anxiety. However, a man who knows himself, who practices shadow work and delves into his own archetypes, doesn't need coldness as a mask. He effortlessly conveys presence. It's an interesting paradox because the less a man tries to appear powerful, the more the female psyche can interpret him as such. Spirituality shows us that true strength lies not in appearing distant, but in being centered in the self. When a man learns to differentiate between persona, what he presents to the world, and ego, what he believes himself to be, he discovers that power isn't displayed, it's felt. And a woman grasps this instinctively. It's not the absence of emotions that attracts her, but the feeling that a man isn't a slave to them. Consider historical examples. Leaders like Marcus Aurelius or even figures like Nelson Mandela, who didn't need emotional outbursts to convey authority. They demonstrated a quiet assurance that touched deeper than any act of calculated coldness. But there's a subtle trap. When coldness is used as a conscious strategy, it loses its magic and becomes manipulation. The female unconscious senses when absence isn't natural but forced. Therefore, the path is not to learn to be cold, but to learn to be whole. When a man accesses his own archetypes, integrates shadow and light, and faces the good-natured persona that imprisons him, he no longer needs to prove anything. Coldness loses ground, and in its place, true presence emerges. And perhaps that's why, when indifference appears, it stirs so much. Not because of the ice itself, but because of the desire it awakens in the shadow, opening the door to the next mystery. Why indifference activates the shadow of desire. Why indifference activates the shadow of desire. Indifference is like a spark that directly touches the shadow of human desire. Carl Jung explained that what is denied or rejected by others tends to infiltrate the unconscious as an object of fascination. Spirituality translates this into something simple. The more distant something seems, the more the ego transforms it into a trophy. When someone demonstrates indifference, the other person's psyche reacts as if faced with a puzzle. It's the same with a child. The more you say, "you can't touch," the more they feel the urge to reach out. The unconscious works this way, seeking what has been veiled, trying to fill the space left open by rejection. And in the realm of relationships, this becomes fuel for desire. The curious thing is that this indifference doesn't have to be aggressive. Often it's simply the absence of excessive effort. When a woman senses that a man isn't desperate for her attention, it triggers a contrast within her. If he doesn't want me that much, why do I want more? The answer lies in shadow work. Repressed desire finds in indifference a mirror of its own neediness. It's at this point that the ego begins to work against reason. It interprets silence as defiance and detachment as a sign of worth. The persona that doesn't beg seems more solid, more centered, almost untouchable. And this ignites the invisible flame that fuels desire. We can see this in everyday examples. Who hasn't noticed that in the workplace or among friends, the one who tries least to please is precisely the one who arouses the most curiosity? It's the colleague who doesn't smile all the time, but when he speaks, everyone listens. Or the man who, instead of showering compliments, remains attentive but selective with his words. This indifference is interpreted as a sign of inner abundance. He doesn't need to prove anything, doesn't need to chase validation. And the feminine instinct, upon realizing this, activates an unconscious quest to conquer precisely the one who doesn't give in easily. Desire, in this case, is less about the person themselves and more about the archetype they represent, the unapproachable. But it's important to note, indifference isn't an absence of humanity. When it transforms into cruelty, it stops activating desire and starts arousing defensiveness. The difference lies in the balance between ego and self. A man who knows himself doesn't need to be cold to be desired. He simply needs to not depend on others' approval. Spirituality teaches that this is true magnetism. It's not about not caring, but about not being chained. This attitude provokes a silent question in the other person's unconscious. What is there in them that I don't yet have? It's the absence of neediness that seduces, because it directly contrasts with the hidden weaknesses of the shadow. And herein lies the fascinating paradox. Indifference activates desire because it creates a void, and the void demands filling. The less you offer, the more space you open for imagination. The unconscious loves to fill gaps with fantasies, and that's what keeps the flame burning. However, when detachment is authentic, it's not calculated. It's the fruit of a true integration between shadow, ego, and persona. And it's at this point that the turning point arises. The less you need, the more they want you. Not by magic, but because absence creates contrast, and contrast becomes irresistible to the psyche. The paradox of detachment: the less you need, the more they want you. Human beings have a curious tendency. The less you seem to need something or someone, the more the world seems to want to offer you just that. Carl Jung would say this is a symbolic movement of the collective unconscious, where detachment is interpreted as power. The ego, when not desperate for validation, conveys security, and this security is irresistible. It's like in spirituality, those who don't beg, attract. When a man or a woman demonstrates that their life doesn't depend on the gaze of another, they immediately become more magnetic. The paradox lies there. The less one seeks, the more one finds. It's the play of psychic energy, where the shadow of the other is activated by the absence of need. Consider everyday examples. At work, employees who don't beg for recognition and do their job with determination tend to be more noticed than those who ask for praise at every turn. In relationships, those who don't beg for messages but stick to their routines generate more interest than those who are always available. This isn't coldness, it's simply the absence of ego anxiety. The detached persona is interpreted as an archetype of abundance. It's as if their very presence says, "I don't need it, but I'm here." And this simple detail is enough to reverse the dynamic. Desire, in this case, isn't born from excessive effort, but from the tranquility that comes from within. This paradox can be cultivated consciously, but never forced. If a man tries to appear detached just to generate attraction, the unconscious sees through the sham. It's like a garment that doesn't fit well. Everyone notices something is out of place. True detachment arises from inner work, from shadow work, when you face your own shadow and realize that external validation is not a source of life. Jung spoke of individuation, the process of being whole without relying on masks. When someone reaches this stage, detachment isn't a strategy, it's a consequence. And the fascination that arises from it is inevitable because it reflects real, unrehearsed security. In practice, practicing detachment means cultivating a life so rich that others are merely a complement, not a center. Reading good books, like Meditations by Marcus Aurelius or The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, helps remind us that abundance begins within. Investing time in hobbies, projects, and even learning new skills creates an energy that radiates. Those who have their own lives attract more than those who live for the attention of others. This is a silent law of the psyche. The unconscious values more what is not easily accessible. Therefore, detachment is not indifference, it is self-sufficiency. And those who find pleasure in their own company carry an invisible power. And here's the secret few understand. Detachment doesn't diminish desire, it multiplies it. Because desire isn't born from what's guaranteed, but from what seems to be at risk. When someone realizes you're not needed, the unconscious urge to be chosen arises. This is where spirituality intersects with psychology. The self speaks louder than the ego's neediness. The paradox is simple yet powerful. When you let go, the world draws closer. When you grasp, the world recedes. And perhaps it's precisely this invisible movement that reveals the deepest root of the connection between desire and rejection. The unconscious root that links desire and rejection. Desire and rejection walk side by side, as if they were secret siblings hidden in the unconscious. Carl Jung showed us that the psyche functions in opposing pairs: light and shadow, love and hate, attraction and repulsion. When someone feels rejection, the shadow awakens an opposing force, transforming that absence into an object of fascination. It's almost a psychic law. What is denied us gains greater value. Spirituality translates this simply. The ego desires precisely what it cannot have. That's why so many love stories seem to arise not from immediate reciprocity, but from the initial barrier that ignites the inner fire. The unconscious creates the link between desire and rejection, as if it were an archetypal dance. This bond can be observed from childhood. A child who receives a no immediately feels the urge to insist, because the prohibition gives the object its flavor. The same happens in adult relationships. When one person pulls away, the other person desires it even more. It's not rational, it's instinctive. The ego, when thwarted, projects a promise of hidden value onto rejection. The persona of the unapproachable acquires the status of a rare treasure. Shadow work helps us understand how we carry these scars from an early age. Often, the intense desire we feel for someone isn't true love, but an unconscious attempt to repair old wounds linked to parental rejection. And this is where psychology and spirituality intersect. In real life, this reveals itself in small situations. Consider an example. A person receives 100 likes on a photo, but focuses on the one that didn't come from the specific person they wanted. Or even, in the workplace, the praise of many doesn't carry the same weight as the silence of those who didn't acknowledge it. It's rejection that creates the desire to be seen by the one who remained silent. This unconscious mechanism shows how vulnerable the ego is to absences. And until we recognize this, we remain trapped in a cycle. The more rejection, the more desire. The more desire, the more vulnerability. Spirituality calls this cycle the illusion of the ego, where we confuse value with what we lack. But there is a way out. When the individual begins to integrate their shadow, they realize that the desire linked to rejection is not about the other, but about themselves. Carl Jung would call this individuation, the process of removing the projection of the other and looking within. When we understand that the root of this mechanism lies in our own emotional wounds, we free ourselves from the game. Rejection ceases to be a trigger for desire and becomes simply a fact of reality. This does not mean coldness, but emotional maturity. Spirituality teaches, the self does not desire what rejects it, because it has already found fulfillment within itself. It is a profound but possible process, and it brings lightness. And it is precisely in this lightness that the paradox reveals itself. The more we free ourselves from the desire born of rejection, the more magnetic we become. Because absence ceases to be a wound and becomes merely silence, and those who are not bound by silence transmit abundance. Fascination, then, is no longer born of absence, but of presence. This is the point at which desire ceases to be chained to no and begins to flow naturally. And perhaps this is why often it is absence that creates more presence than any words. How absence creates more presence than any word. There are times when silence speaks louder than any speech. Carl Jung said that the unconscious doesn't need words to express itself. It manifests itself in symbols, gestures, and even in emptiness. Spirituality understands this as the subtle language of the self, which often reveals itself not through what we say, but through what we fail to say. Absence in this context becomes a living presence. When someone is not there in an obvious way, the space left is filled by the other's imagination. And the curious thing is that the mind, when trying to fill gaps, tends to exaggerate. It's like an echo growing within the unconscious. The more silence, the louder it resonates. This phenomenon is evident in everyday relationships. A man who doesn't respond immediately to a message can generate more impact than one who responds within seconds with long sentences. It's not about manipulation, but about psychic dynamics. The ego interprets absence as a sign of value. If he's not available now, he must have something important in his life. This is where the persona acts as a mask of mystery. Even unintentionally, absence can be interpreted as heightened presence. Shadow work helps reveal this projection. What the other person feels isn't about you, but about what they themselves carry in their shadow. External emptiness awakens the inner fullness of fantasies. We can also see this in the power of memories. Often, physical presence fades, but absence remains alive, occupying space in memory. A past relationship may resonate more strongly in the mind than current conversations with someone new. This shows how the psyche values what is inaccessible. Absence becomes an archetype, a symbol of something greater than reality. Spirituality explains this as the energy of detachment. When we don't try to hold on, we create space for others to see us more clearly. This is why wise leaders often use the strategy of silence, letting the space speak for them. Absence, paradoxically, becomes expanded presence. In practice, applying this means learning not to overwhelm others with excessive words. Instead of constantly justifying yourself, allowing spaces for silence can be much more powerful. Think of a speech. If each sentence is followed by another without pause, the audience loses their bearings. But when there's silence between words, the weight of each increases. It's the same in relationships. The ego, when it tries to fill every space with explanations, kills the mystery. Absence, on the other hand, creates magnetism. Reading good books like Carlos Castaneda's The Power of Silence can open your mind to this exercise. Spirituality reminds us silence is not empty. It is full of invisible meanings. And what few understand is that this absence doesn't mean disinterest. On the contrary, it's often an invitation for the other to move toward them. It's like a magnetic field, invisible yet irresistible. Absence creates space, and space creates symbolic presence. When someone doesn't speak, the other's unconscious speaks for them. And it's in this invisible game that fascination is born. Because in the end, it's not the words that most impact us, but the silences that force us to feel. And it's precisely at this point that the male ego, when it tries too hard to please, implodes under the weight of its own words. The male ego that implodes when trying to please too much. The male ego has a silent trap, believing that the more it pleases, the more it will be valued. But in practice, the opposite happens. Carl Jung said that the ego, when seeking external approval, loses touch with the self and distances itself from its true strength. The man who tries to be nice all the time creates an artificial persona, a fabricated character to be accepted. And the more he strives to conform to other people's expectations, the more he implodes within. Spirituality calls this internal betrayal, abandoning oneself in the name of a love that never lasts. The result? He feels empty, exhausted, and invisible, even after giving his all. The female psyche perceives this almost instinctively. A man who tries too hard to please others conveys insecurity because he demonstrates that he needs the other person to validate his own existence. It's as if he's silently saying, "Without you, I'm nothing." The problem is that the unconscious perceives this neediness as weakness. The woman's shadow interprets this excessive effort not as love, but as a lack of self-worth. Shadow work is essential here. The man needs to face his need for approval and ask himself, why do I feel I need to give everything to be chosen? The paradox is cruel. The more he tries to be indispensable, the more disposable he becomes. Practical examples abound. Think of the man who sends flowers every day, responds to every message within seconds, and cancels appointments to always be available. At first glance, it seems romantic, But over time, the energy behind this is interpreted as desperation. The ego, stifled, implodes because it can't sustain this performance. Instead of creating magnetism, it creates repulsion. Spirituality teaches that no one can give what they don't have. And if a man isn't complete within himself, his attempts to please come across as emotional begging. The result is predictable. The relationship loses its balance and desire fades. In practical life, the solution isn't to stop being attentive, but to change the origin of this gesture. Instead of pleasing others to be accepted, a man should act from the self, offering because he overflows, not because he needs it. This can be trained with simple habits, investing in personal projects, cultivating hobbies, strengthening friendships, and taking care of his health. Reading works like Carl Jung's Man and His Symbols can open one's eyes to the difference between persona and essence. When a man finds value in himself, his gesture of attention ceases to be a plea and becomes a choice. And this difference is felt almost magically. His presence gains weight, not through words, but through the energy it carries. And here's the point few have the courage to see. Overpleasing is, deep down, a form of manipulation. It's trying to buy love with effort. But the female unconscious detects this quickly. Men implode because they don't understand that true fascination lies in silent security, not in limitless availability. Spirituality reminds us that it's better to be whole and lose someone than to lose ourselves just to avoid being alone. And perhaps that's why silent security attracts more than empty promises, because the silence of the self speaks louder than any performance. Why quiet security is more attractive than empty promises. There's one thing the female psyche clearly understands. Empty promises don't sustain desire, but silent security creates lasting magnetism. Carl Jung explained that the ego loves to promise the world, but the self doesn't need words to prove anything. When a man overpromises, his persona creates expectations that the female unconscious quickly recognizes as fragile. A man who remains centered, who isn't quick to make declarations but demonstrates consistency in his actions, exudes confidence. Spirituality shows that it's the energy of presence, not speech, that truly seduces, because security doesn't speak, it's felt. A promise, when unsupported, is perceived as an ego-driven attempt to manipulate. I'll change. I'll make you happy. I'll never let you down. Words like these sound sweet, but in practice, they're incapable of carrying the weight of reality. The unconscious senses the discrepancy between what's said and what's experienced. Therefore, many women are attracted to men who don't say much but maintain a firm stance. This silence isn't disinterest, it's security. It's the archetype of the inner guardian who doesn't need to advertise his strength because his mere presence already communicates it. Shadow work demonstrates this clearly. When the shadow is integrated, there's no need to prove anything. Practical examples are everywhere. Consider a leader in the workplace. One who speaks little but follows through on every decision inspires more respect than one who promises bonuses, trips, and rewards that never arrive. Or in relationships, the man who doesn't promise, "I'll give you the world," but who in practice shows up when needed, truly listens, and keeps his word in the little things, generates more desire than one who fills the air with pretty phrases. Quiet security is, in fact, a reflection of the integrated self. It's what makes someone feel, I can rest by his side because I don't need to decipher his intentions. This psychic rest is rare, and that's why it's so attractive. Spirituality teaches that the less you need to promise, the stronger your presence, because energy isn't in speech, but in coherence. Books like Meditations by Marcus Aurelius or The Courage to Be Imperfect by Brené Brown show how vulnerability and quiet firmness go hand in hand. The ego wants to impress, but the soul wants consistency. And a woman, deep down, doesn't seek emotional fireworks, but the tranquility of someone who won't disappear at the first storm. It's the contrast between empty speech and solid energy that awakens true desire. And this can't be imitated with rehearsed words. This is why silent security creates fascination. It conveys something no promise can buy: peace. The ego speaks of the future, but the self shows presence now. And presence is the most valuable currency in any relationship. Deep down, we all seek someone who sustains our soul, because those who sustain themselves can sustain others. The emptiness of promises dissolves before the solidity of silence, and perhaps it is precisely this difference that explains why, even today, the ancient dynamic between hunter and prey continues to govern relationships. The ancient hunter-prey dynamic that still governs relationships. Even though we live in modern times where apps and social media seem to dominate the game of love, we still carry within us the archetypal memory of the hunt. Carl Jung explained that archetypes are universal patterns, engraved in the collective unconscious, and the figure of hunter and prey continues to silently operate in relationships. Spirituality shows us that no matter how much society changes, the human ego still reacts to the ancestral instinct to pursue what flees, to value what hides. It is this primitive dance that explains why absence can seem like power and indifference, magnetism. The unconscious, without realizing it, relives the ancestral scene. The one who flees is the same one who awakens the prey. In female behavior, this instinct manifests when a woman associates coldness with power, because the inaccessible triggers the elusive prey archetype in her. In male behavior, the instinct arises when a man takes pleasure in conquering what resists, as if his validation lies in proving his hunting prowess. Shadow work reveals that deep down, this dynamic is less about love and more about wounds of rejection and a desire for control. But even so, it remains alive. This is why many people confuse intensity with true love, when in reality, they are simply trapped in the archetypal game of chase and flight that has been repeated for millennia. Practical examples of this dynamic are everywhere. Think of a relationship where one partner is always available. Desire quickly cools because the hunting instinct disappears. However, when someone is selective or even distant, the other feels a kind of inner calling to conquer. It's the same energy we see in war stories, literary novels, and even popular songs. Pleasure is not just in the encounter, but in the pursuit. The ego values what requires effort, while despising what is handed to them on a silver platter. Spirituality shows us that this cycle is only broken when the self awakens, because the self neither hunts nor flees, it simply is. This ancestral dynamic, however, isn't something we need to unconsciously repeat. Recognizing it is already a step toward transforming it. By doing shadow work, the individual understands that the fascination with the inaccessible often hides their own shadow. The fear of not being enough, the lack of recognition, the compulsion to prove their worth. When these wounds are healed, the relationship ceases to be a game of hunter and prey and becomes a meeting of equals. This doesn't eliminate the mystery or the attraction, but it frees them from the compulsion. The man stops hunting to assert himself, and the woman stops running to feel desired. Both can find themselves on another level, that of conscious presence. But until this process happens, the dance continues. And that's precisely why, even today, many relationships are governed more by instinct than by conscious choices. The psyche, by reviving this archetype, keeps alive the fascination with the inaccessible and the pleasure of conquest. However, there's an even more powerful archetype that governs this game, that of the inaccessible man, whose figure blends the mystery of absence with the allure of the forbidden. And it's at this point that the female unconscious, often without realizing it, surrenders to what seems impossible to possess. The archetype of the inaccessible man and the fascination of the forbidden. There's an archetype that spans centuries of stories, romances, and mythologies, the unapproachable man. Carl Jung explained that archetypes are primordial images engraved in the collective unconscious, and this particular figure has become one of the most powerful symbols of desire. He represents what is forbidden, what cannot be easily attained, and for this very reason, he becomes irresistible. Spirituality shows that the ego is attracted to mystery, to the space it cannot control. The unapproachable man awakens an ancient feeling in women, that winning his attention is equivalent to overcoming a challenge. The fascination in this case lies not in what he offers, but in what he denies. This archetype appears in different cultures. From the lone knight of medieval legends to the misunderstood artist of modern narratives, the image is always the same. Someone who doesn't give in easily, someone who harbors an inaccessible inner world. The feminine unconscious projects a promise of depth onto this man, as if the absence of words concealed psychic treasures. Shadow work helps us understand why this fascination arises. It reflects the feminine shadow itself, which desires to possess what seems untouchable. The ego interprets inaccessibility as power, and the psyche confuses silence with depth. And so the myth perpetuates itself generation after generation. In practice, this archetype manifests itself in everyday relationships. Think of the man who doesn't respond to everyone, who doesn't immediately reveal his entire life, but who demonstrates self-confidence. He doesn't need to explicitly reject. His simple stance already conveys the signal that he's not at the mercy of others' approval. This arouses curiosity, desire, and even obsession. It's the same mechanism that makes forbidden things more fascinating. A censored book, a kept secret, a locked room. The unconscious values the inaccessible as if it were more precious. And in the emotional realm, this archetype of the inaccessible man becomes a kind of mirror of one's own neediness. But there's a crucial point. This fascination isn't healthy when experienced unconsciously. A woman who projects everything onto this archetype risks losing herself in illusions, believing that absence is synonymous with greatness. The male ego, in turn, can hide behind this inaccessibility as a mask, mistaking isolation for power. Jungian spirituality and psychology warn true magnetism lies not in being inaccessible, but in being whole. When a man finds the self, he doesn't need to shut himself away to be valued. He already transmits presence. But until this integration occurs, the fascination with the forbidden remains a dangerous game, both for the observer and for the one who embodies the archetype. And it is at this point that the narrative takes a turn, because the archetype of the unapproachable may be seductive, but the process of individuation demands that the good guy persona die so that the self can speak for itself. This is true power. Not that of manufactured mystery, but that of brutal authenticity. When the mask falls, when the persona dissolves, what remains is the essence, and this essence doesn't need to be forbidden to be desired. It simply is. And perhaps that is why, in the end, the greatest fascination lies not in the unapproachable man, but in the real man, who dares to let the good guy persona die so that his soul can speak in its own voice. What happens when the nice persona dies and the self speaks for itself? The death of the nice persona is one of the most transformative moments in a man's journey. Carl Jung explained that the persona is the social mask we wear to be accepted, and when it's constructed solely to please, it becomes a prison. When this mask falls, the ego suffers because it can no longer hide behind promises or rehearsed gestures. But it is precisely then that the self, the deepest and most authentic part of the being, begins to speak for itself. Spirituality shows that this is a symbolic rebirth, the end of the persona and the beginning of the real man. And this process, though painful, is liberating because it opens space for a genuine presence impossible to fabricate. When the good guy persona dies, the relationship with desire changes completely. The man stops chasing external validation and begins to position himself centeredly. He no longer says yes to everything because he understands that a well-placed no is worth more than 1,000 concessions. This stance isn't born of coldness, but of self-knowledge. Shadow work is fundamental here. Looking within, recognizing the shadow, accepting one's own flaws, and integrating the pain. This creates a strength that doesn't need to be displayed. The ego, previously anxious, quiets because it finds in the self an inexhaustible source of security. And the female psyche senses this instinctively. It senses the difference between performance and authenticity. Practical examples help understand this shift. The man who once accepted any invitation just to avoid displeasing now chooses where he invests his energy. He's not afraid of missing out on opportunities because he understands that true connections aren't based on submission. At work, he doesn't bow to every request, but learns to negotiate firmly. In relationships, he doesn't chase after those who don't value him because he knows his worth isn't dependent on others. This stance frightens the female ego, accustomed to control, but at the same time arouses fascination. Because deep down, everyone is attracted to someone who is their own man. Spirituality teaches that when the self speaks for itself, life takes on a new depth. The individual begins to effortlessly transmit magnetism because their energy is no longer dispersed in attempts to please. They don't promise what they can't deliver. They don't don masks to appear better. They don't play the game of manipulation. Their mere presence is enough. Books like Dan Millman's The Way of the Peaceful Warrior illustrate this state of consciousness well, the quiet force that doesn't need to impose itself, but also doesn't bend. The self, unlike the ego, doesn't seek applause. It simply is. And in this being, it becomes irresistible because it represents something rare, truth in a world full of masks. And here lies the end of this journey. When the nice guy persona dies, man ceases to be predictable. He is no longer driven by neediness but by presence, and it is this presence that awakens desire because it doesn't depend on others, but radiates from within. The allure no longer lies in calculated inaccessibility, but in radical authenticity. The female psyche recognizes this immediately because it is attracted not to perfection, but to wholeness. And that is why the brutal truth continues to echo. Women desire not the man who strives to please, but the one who doesn't mind losing applause because he has already found within himself the root of his own strength. Now tell me, what's the point of knowing all this brutal truth if you keep betraying yourself to please? What's the point of understanding Carl Jung, shadow work, ego, and archetypes? If in your daily life you still kneel before the need to be accepted, the game doesn't change when the other person changes. The game changes when you decide to stop being predictable, when you understand that the good persona must die for the self to speak with authority. And then the question that hurts the most arises, are you willing to lose applause to finally be whole? Think about it, because life doesn't reward those who beg, but those who don't need it. And maybe that's the cut you need to make in yourself. Stop confusing pleasing with loving. Stop confusing presence with submission. So I ask you, how long will you beg for recognition? And when will you choose the silence that attracts more than 1,000 promises? If this video opened something up inside you, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue this journey. Because from now on, you will never look at human desire the same way again.